to Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're just joined by Terminal Philosophy to discuss modern intellectual taboos. So, Terminal Philosophy, you were talking with me and others in private, and you were very animated about the modern intellectual taboos that are currently there. So my first question for you is, why are taboos important? And is contemporary society, does it have more taboos than the ones have had historically? And how do you see that sort of dynamic?
Well, first of all, thank you both for having me here. I really appreciate it. But yeah, to the heart of your question, why are taboos important? Well, taboos are interesting because if taboos are strong enough in any given society, and these taboos have important implications in either politics or society or social movements or even in the lives of regular people, if taboos are strong enough and it becomes more and more difficult to discuss things, well, then what you end up doing, of course, I think most people know where I'm going with this, is that you end up sort of creating separate pockets or really separate sort of echo chambers throughout society where it's safe to talk about this topic or that topic here, but in wider society it's not. And so broader society isn't able to engage with this subject, any subject in particular, and and regular people who may not be interested in higher education or more intellectual topics, well, they may develop their own opinions on things, and then of course the elites of society will maintain their own opinion about it, and so you have these very differing bifurcating views between elites, regular people, perhaps the upper middle class will be somewhere in between that. And so it's important to discuss. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Taboos are simply important because if strong enough, they can lead down a unfortunate path of anti-intellectual curiosity, and that creates a lot of problems. And I think we would all agree here that there's quite a number of taboo subjects in the United States and Great Britain and Europe and elsewhere. I think there's actually, juicy taboo subjects in almost any society that I can think of. But yeah, I think I'll leave my first answer at that.
Do you think modern US or British society has kind of got more taboos than it had in, say, the past 100 years? And have they? Are the taboos more taboo, as it were? Would you say that there is greater social sanction for discussing verboten topics than there was in the relative recent past?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would have to say that, first of all, in the past, you've got perhaps by around 1900, I think societal norms were more strictly enforced. I think that's widely agreed upon, and the taboos that sort of are probably that were accompanying those norms were probably more strictly enforced as well. I think there are probably more taboos numerically speaking, and while I won't exaggerate the situation, or at least I won't attempt to exaggerate the situation with taboos being harshly enforced, but what you have now is that you have sort of this continuously consolidating enforcement of the of companies in Silicon Valley, and as well as the government and other institutions like the media and academia in the United States, that while they can't necessarily enforce things, they can't make certain discussion or refutation of certain taboos illegal by law, they can certainly make it a hot topic, so to speak, in the sense that if you discuss it, you're not in the in crowd, you're not in the enlightened modern person's crowd. You're part of some type of modern day freak show, so to speak. So while I think it's probably easier on the ground to hold certain taboos, if those are expressed in a certain way, then you can potentially lose your job. You can potentially, I guess it depends on the country, but you can end up paying government fines. And, if you're this is a bit of more of an extreme example, but if you're breaking taboos in a place like North Korea, well, that includes an entirely different set of consequences. So yes, I'll say for now, and I suppose there's plenty of room for disagreement and good examples to the contrary, but I'll just say that it's probably easier to have taboos in the modern day, but you are incentivized to just simply kind of go along with the mainstream flow and not rock the boat, as it were.
As far as arguments in favor of taboos are concerned, one of the reasons some things are taboo, this is sort of piggybacking off of Swithin's question, was that taboos are sometimes taboo for a reason. They're hot topics, and you don't really want it. It's not pertinent to discuss that. I mean, the United States and Britain's. I mean, you get this from Peter Hitchens. Sort of the United States and Britain's founding myth might be World War I or World War II. And that's the origins of NATO, for example. So, you don't want to peek in too much to the sort of weird intricacies of the 1930s, for example. And this might bring up one of our other topics. So there's certain topics that are taboo, I'd argue, for a reason, and that they somewhat undermine this societal order. And of course, famously, Socrates sort of, was attacked and poisoned for the very reason for attacking taboos. And this sort of goes into, I've seen you with Keith Preston, who's somewhat famous anarchist in some ways. Intellectually, I think he's great. Isn't it true that a ruling class sort of has to have taboos to protect themselves or their origin stories? TP?
Yes, I think you've got a great point there. I mean, taboos can certainly be good, and given the whatever taboo is in question, I would assume that just from a bird's eye view of any civilization or society, the reason why taboos exist is because they help enforce some sort of political and social reality. And so, well, yes, of course, theoretically on paper, that is certainly a good thing, and these, most modern people are looking at entities like the European Union or NATO, or these sort of more, you could say, peace and productivity oriented phenomena as a good thing. For example, someone might say, well, how could you be against the European Union? This is a safeguard against something like a World War II, or how could you be against this sort of various trade agreements? These are meant to bolster multiple economies at once, and why are you antagonizing a potentially bad thing to happen? So yes, I think certain taboos, it's certainly okay, and of course there are taboos around, for example, like the age of consent and all sorts of things. So, I would never be one to just come out and say, let's have this sort of anarchic, state of the way we perceive taboos, and all taboos are just, the way for the man to keep regular people down. Certainly not. No, I mean, taboos, of course, with like the age of consent, eventually translate into things like laws. So, of course, there are good things. I would argue, though, maybe between both of the first answer I gave to why taboos can be a bad thing and why taboos can be a good thing is that there seems to be a sort of middle ground, or kind of a no man's land. Maybe that's not the best way to describe it, but sort of a gray area between the black and white, where there are certain subjects that are considered taboo, but you don't necessarily have to have your life ruined for discussing them, but it's still suggested that you just simply not question it. You go along with the sort of the modern day order, and I think we have a few subjects for those, but just to your point, yeah, taboos can certainly be a good thing. They do help enforce order and sort of a a homogeneous society, if that's one's goal, for sure, that can help enforce those certain things. It can help. I would say just help certain societal identities persist given all the fast changes of the modern world. So yeah, I would also agree that taboos can be a good thing as well.
I would agree that taboos are necessary in a sense. They're sort of an outflow of society's moral structure, really, and the moral beliefs that the society holds. And that's not true. What seems to me to be the case, now my history may be off here, is that if you go from the early 20th century, there seems to be more sort of social taboos, as in taboos regarding correct conduct. But there seems to be, to some extent, less intellectual taboos, insofar as, now at least my understanding, you had all these sort of scientists in the late 19th, early 20th century who could basically discuss whatever they wanted to. Obviously, it was pushback, but there wasn't, there didn't seem to be, at least from what I know, a large sort of swathe of people trying to completely get rid of them and remove them, as it were, from polite society, although I suppose that you could argue to some extent a product of the lack of sort of mass democracy, because it didn't really matter, because the plebs wouldn't be negatively influenced by it because they wouldn't have the access to it. But so what seems to happen in the 20th century, especially since the 1990s at least, the range of acceptable discussed topics, I mean, these are discussed in polite society, not even like you saying that a certain view on this is correct or otherwise, but actually even having the discussion is just sort of verboten. It is bizarre. I mean, an example of this was a guy I know posted a link to an article claiming that the coronavirus could have come out of a lab leak in China, and someone commented like, "Why are you posting this? This is just going to inflame hatred of the East Asian community." And it's like, well, he's just asking whether it came out of it. And there seems to be so many more sort of moral things attached to just discussing what is actually true in a certain sense. Just like historically, I mean, it doesn't sort of say anything particularly about a group or society as a whole, but was it a lab leak or was it bat soup? What was it? So that's my sort of my general sort of feeling on this. So to the some particular taboos, TP, that you think are certainly in society, and this nicely relates to coronavirus to a large extent, is scientism. So TP, what do you mean by scientism, and how is it sort of come to sort of hold such a great status in society, such that to be against scientism is somehow verboten and deviant?
Right. Well, yeah, scientism is certainly I think a good centerpiece, or at least a very, I would say, a very self-evident taboo subject at present. Basically, scientism, as I understand it, and as I have observed it, is that as long as something, whether it be an article, a study, a TV show, a quick 30-second now this video on social media, if something claims to be scientific, well, then it must be true, and it would be, it shouldn't be criticized, or you should just trust it. Just because it has the label of science behind it. Now, I've seen everything from Vox and BuzzFeed and Jezebel, Rick and Morty, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Netflix, and many other institutions and people engage in different softer or harder versions of scientism. And with scientism, again, as you said before, with where you were a part of a social media conversation where a gentleman was just expressing some just some thoughts as to whether or not the coronavirus came out of a lab. Was it some sinister Chinese plot to test some sort of bioweapon, or did it come from bat soup, so on and so forth? Well, or, again, if you're questioning certain scientific data that's presented in a certain way that appears to be political in nature, well, if you're questioning that, then many people will believe that, you must have some sort of religious agenda, or you must have some sort of sinister political or social intention with that. Like, you're trying to sneak in, you're trying to Trojan horse some sort of indirect, nefarious line of questioning to make people think a certain way. And, for most people, that's not the case. I mean, you could even take an issue like, the wage gap of women, or the apparent wage gap of women in the United States and Great Britain, or in other various places in Europe. I'm of the belief that that's mostly been a fairly well debunked topic. But again, simply questioning that means that you're some, dyed-in-the-wool misogynist. It's just that, no, I mean, when you really look into the data, it's just that women work fewer full-time jobs than men, and many women end up bearing children, and they just simply can't work a full-time job as often as men. It doesn't mean that men are better than women, in any objective or even a subjective sense. It's just that, when some, potentially condescending or vacuous ladies, shrieking about, how the wage gap is very real and you need to be quiet about it, perhaps one of the things you might say is that, well, you have some sort of nefarious agenda, like, you're up to no good. And so that is probably, I think that statement right there basically underpins a lot of the conversations around most, I would say, political or social taboos in the modern day. Now, of course, that's still issue specific, but again, with scientism, it's supported by so many different angles within society. I mean, for example, this is something that's now academia. I was about to say academia outright, but academia is actually one of the better institutions or entities within society who is able to sort of self-reflect on this, because you can find many lectures by philosophers or philosophers of science that are able to identify scientism quite well. Now, for example, it's difficult to locate the where metaphysics goes into cosmology and vice versa, and where the role of science, how science is played in various cosmological or physics type of subjects. But at least academia has some good experts in philosophy of science. David Chalmers is a good one, and there is a British female professor whose name I'll find it here in just a moment. But there are many good lectures on basically the criteria of scientism and how to locate it. But it's just the preference of science before anything else. That science is the only game in town for locating significance or finding truth. And scientism has sort of a way of eliminating sort of the more beautifully mysterious aspects of both the arts, the humanities, and the hard sciences in itself. It has a way. There's almost like I wouldn't say this for every proponent of scientism, but there is almost an underlying lowest common denominator preference for some type of nihilism in scientism. It's like it's almost like as might not be the best way to describe this, but a type of like evangelical atheism that goes along with scientism. And in addition, with many people who support or kind of give scientism a free pass in academia, although that's kind of a half and half type of a thing, you've got very well-funded journalistic institutions like Vox and BuzzFeed that, or now this, where there will be a quick 30-second video on how, apparently, bad groups, quote unquote, are supporting this or this politician or this bad idea, and it's supported by science that this is a bad idea, and we don't get you don't really get a source, you don't really get to divulge into this information. It's just like, well, it's scientific, so you just better go along with it, or you're some backwards person from the Middle Ages or something like that. And then, sorry, I'll wrap this point up, but last but not least, you have prominent individuals like Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson. Of course, most people from our generation, I mean, I'm 30, so it's common for my generation to have grown up watching Bill Nye the Science Guy, where, basic scientific principles and theories can be explained in sort of it's just a fun kid show. But now in the 2010s and 2020s, I mean, Bill Nye is almost taking this new image where he's some angry, condescending, pretentious enforcer of science, and he has all these like YouTube videos, and he has his new show, of course, where he's like dropping the F-bomb, and if you question any of this, you're just some like bumbling George Bush era, idiot neocon, and just agree with it and shut up type of a thing. And then the last guy, we can talk about him more if you'd like, but the last guy is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who most people don't know this, but Neil deGrasse Tyson has ended up being caught stealing jokes and fabricating and lying about educational statistics and scientific statistics. But again, Neil deGrasse Tyson is every like atheist girl's, purple-haired girl's like wet dream, because he's black. He is continuing the great tradition of Carl Sagan of exploring the cosmos, and exploring the cosmos is purely it can only be the social territory of atheist skeptical atheists and leftist intellectuals, and anyone, you can't, like, how could you dare question Neil deGrasse Tyson? And because he's just like this perfect image of someone to continue the preference for science in a lot of these like popular social spheres. So sorry for the filibuster, but I think there's a proper introduction to scientism.
Yeah, as far as scientism is concerned, I would say scientism is the primary religion of our society. I mean, if you want to take an anthropological view of it, and you go to an island and ask, what god do you worship? I would say scientism is the god that Western Europe, United States, for the most part, worships. As far as Bill Nye and Tyson are concerned, I would totally agree. They're somewhat unwatchable in certain ways. Although Tyson was on the Joe Rogan Experience, and he's not as bad. He's not as bad. I think a slight demarcation between the two is required. But as far as I'm a similar age, I grew up in public schools, middle school, and they would watch that would be part of the curriculum, watching his show. Disney also has a lot of ties to it. I think Two Rides have him as a promoter, as a narrator, so to speak, or presenter. So yeah, corporate America likes Bill Nye. Public schools like Bill Nye. He is kind of like a priestly person in that regard. And it's interesting. Bill Nye is just a mechanical engineer. That's one funny thing to bring up. So when Bill Nye is not an epidemiologist, Bill Nye is not a astrophysicist, Bill Nye is not a statistician. So like if you're going for specialized credentials, he doesn't have them. I mean, in that regard, we probably have about the same amount of education as Bill Nye. So yeah, I would argue that they're like sort of like ordained priestly class from an anthropological viewpoint. As far as the nihilistic point, I would also totally agree, which reminds me of a great quote from G.K. Chesterton in his book Orthodoxy. I love this quote. As a politician, he will cry out that war is a waste of life, and then as a philosopher, that all of life is waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, and then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. So a man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a science meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. So yeah, I would argue this sort of. I love that quote from Chesterton. I would argue that there is a kind of scientism is our primary religion. And as far as religion is concerned, it's a very unsatisfying one because true science is it includes a lot of uncertainty. Lots of uncertainty. We don't know all sorts of things. We take sort of Socratic approach. It's a kind of open approach. It's a very dangerous approach too. I brought up Socrates before. Socrates ended up dead. I mean, for questioning taboos. Tyson and particularly Bill Nye are taboo enforcers. But I'll stop here and pass it back to Swithin. Swithin? Or if you want to
I think that's interesting. With the modern intellectuals who claim to be sort of nihilists, at the same time, if anything goes against proper protocol, as you should do investigation scientifically or in philosophy, then they all go really angry. I remember who was it? Steve Patterson angered Jason Brennan. I think for two reasons. One, that he did a philosophy book but didn't reference anybody, and this was somehow a great sin. Now, I don't think Brennan is a moralist, but it's like, so what? Like, so what if he didn't reference anybody? Like, oh, we're supposed to follow the academic rules, and so, but then somehow, we're going to follow the academic rules, but then within the academic rules, you can say nothing really exists or there is no truth, but then you just don't reference because it was just based on philosophical arguments. Like, what? And then I think somebody else complained, oh, it was completely unethical that you could pay someone to review a book. And it's like, well, I can understand why you might not want to, but this is some great sin from a sort of group of people who would entertain sort of the relative merits of amoralism, which seems somewhat bizarre. With scientism, I think one of the reasons it's become so kind of popular is the natural sciences have have sort of aided a great increase in material well-being and sort of increase in life expectancy and quality of life in a physical sense. And so lots of cachet is placed in it, and so then it becomes scientific. But as both of you point out, it is odd because what seems to be held up as sacrosanct in today's society is the fact-value dichotomy. It's like, well, just because something is this way, it doesn't mean it ought to be this way. So that exists at the same time of people going with lockdowns, like, we must follow the science. It's like, the science doesn't actually tell us very much. It will tell us, okay, assuming it's correct, what will happen if I do X, but it doesn't tell us whether we should do it or not. And so on the one hand, scientism is held in great regard because of the great material advances it's brought, but then it's also used basically as a complete smokescreen to do whatever you actually want to and just claim that this is scientific. That's my sort of general view on scientism. TP, got any other final thoughts on scientism?
Yeah, well, some interesting comments from both of you guys. That was a really cool quote by G.K. Chesterton, by the way. Just by and large, looking at this topic, it's what I've kind of got at here is that it's the scientific. I should say, science doesn't tell us much about how to interface scientific findings or conclusions with society. It's really difficult to then sort of discover something new about something within the hard sciences and then how that should be reflected within broader society. I'm not saying it's not possible, of course. It's just that science has a difficult time explaining to us why we should do X or how we should go about something that's purely in the social spheres. And again, not saying it's not possible, but with the scientism community and sort of the Neil deGrasse Tyson Templar Order and the Bill Nye fan club, it seems like we're being sold the idea that science is for skeptical atheists and left-wing social projects only, and you've just got to go along with us, and if you don't, well, then we'll do everything we can to make you be perceived as this backwards person. And so but yeah, again, even a lot of so-called hardcore Christians aren't anti-scientific. It's just that science has been guilty of going beyond, of trespassing on other properties of on other territories of the humanities, and even on itself, about how far its claims can really reach within epistemological issues. So, but yeah, scientism is certainly the modern day religion, and it's going to be here to stay for a while. But yeah, I think that's probably a decent closing comment on scientism.
Talking about religion, another topic we had was the Crusades. What is taboo in your view about the Crusades, and what does this tell us about society? That discussing what was the genuine cause of the Crusades, why is that taboo, and what does it tell us about society?
Right. Well, I think perhaps all of us here have either witnessed a conversation or have been a part of a conversation where there is some discussion of the historical legacy of Christianity and whether or not Christianity has brought only good or only bad, or some good and some bad, to people throughout the world in history. And so one of the most popular things to bring up, especially from those who have an anti-Christian stance, is that of the Crusades. Now, the reason why the Crusades are deployed in, rather either debates or even conversations with people who have an anti-Christian preference in their historical view, is that the Crusades, to a lot of people, and this also overlaps with the scientism crowd a bit, I would say, is that the Crusades are perceived as this purely negative thing that was orchestrated only by the Catholic Church. It was done for only nefarious reasons, and it was just purely blood-soaked. It's a one-sided issue. The Catholic Church was out for blood. They were out to kill as many Muslims as possible, and it was basically this this way to bring bloodshed to the Eastern Mediterranean and to expand the Christian sphere of influence in the Middle East. Now, actually, for those of us who are real students of history and are interested in the details, well, it would appear that the origins of the Crusades are much less black and white than Hollywood or modern day journalism, or perhaps the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse members would like to think it is. But really, the origins of the Crusades started in this post-Muhammad political and social atmosphere, where after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, you have basically these various factions among Islam and various warlords that started conquering out of the Arabian Peninsula. And what you have is first the expansion of the patriarchal caliphate from approximately 632 with the death of Muhammad to about 661, where huge swaths of territory like northern Egypt, northern Libya, all of modern day Israel, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, almost all of Iran, parts of western Afghanistan, and I would say the southeastern corner of Turkey, and all the way up to Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. And then the third round of expansions were under the Umayyad Caliphate from 661 to approximately 750, where the expansion continues further into Pakistan, the rest of modern-day Afghanistan, into Tajikistan, and all the way over to the west, where almost all of Tunisia, Algeria, most of Morocco, and all of the Iberian Peninsula are occupied. So again, this all happened from 632 to 750, and there were various wars between the Byzantines, again, the Byzantines, the Latin East Christian Empire, fighting Seljuk troops for control of Anatolia. And this was during the 1070s. I have to apologize, we're going ahead about 300 years now. There were various battles at Ankara, Antioch, and Edessa, Iconium, Nicaea, and of course, Constantinople. Now, the primary, the historical reasons why Pope Urban II in 1095 had called for the Crusades was primarily, it was for three big reasons. It was to aid the Byzantine Empire in the East, to help their Christian brothers in the East. They wanted to take back the Holy Land, which had been occupied for a while now, and create safe passage for Christian pilgrims to travel there. And they also wanted to take historically Christian lands between Europe and the Holy Land. Particularly, there were multiple events where, over the course of about 2 centuries, there were thousands of Christian pilgrims that were just massacred for no apparent reason other than they were Christians by various tribes, or not by various tribes, but by various caliphates and various Seljuk sects and just different Islamic factions, really. Now, you can't just say, well, it was all Islam. Well, there were many different caliphates and various warring caliphates within the broader term of Islam during that time that had different motivations for different conflicts, and so I think that distinction is necessary. And but again, because Pope Urban called for the Crusades, it was believed to have been, this is Christianity going on the offense now, and what was their problem with Islam in the first place? It's all you have to do is just study the history of Islamic expansion out of the peninsula, and there are two really interesting books on this. There is The Tragedy of the Templars by Michael Haag, and then Zoe Oldenburg's The Crusades, and this was written in the 60s, but a long, lengthy book on the Crusades and sort of the centuries that led up to the Crusades that set up this proper historical context, because, again, for the anti-Christian sort of skeptical atheist group, it's that Christians are fanged, medieval Christians are these fanged, blood-soaked creatures out for blood, and everyone else was just minding their own business, and they love to try and set up this simple as possible narrative to make the Catholic Church like they were out to they're the historical bad guys. And so without taking up too much time, I think that's a proper setup for why the Crusades are a taboo to discuss.
The Crusades are interesting partly because it's sort of told as a one-sided story. But before that, I'll point out one of the problems. I think one of the features or bugs is as far as the Crusades are concerned is United States and Britain are both, as well as for the most part Germany, are all Protestant societies, and even France since the Revolution has been a secular society, arguably. So it's somewhat anti-Catholic to begin with. So the defenders of Catholicism in the sort of the Western Europe, United States type areas are few and far between. So that goes back to sort of the we did an episode on Moldbug's ultra Calvinism theory, and in the United States and to some extent Britain were founded by, well, Britain less so. Britain had more of a quick revolution in that regard. But the United States is clearly founded as a sort of Protestant founding society. People like Jefferson and Franklin had no interest in Catholicism. So as far as Catholicism is concerned, that's one of the hidden reasons why I think it doesn't get much defense, because Catholicism is somewhat afterthought in the United States in that regard. Interesting as far as the Spain is concerned. That's another, your point about offense and defense is something that totally gets forgotten. Why Now, it's somewhat disputed, but I visited places like in southern Spain. I was taking a trip to Spain 2 years ago, I think. I was in some of the cities, and you have the walled city of Villa. You have a lot of interesting, artifacts from there. Why are there walled cities and why are there a lot of Vader things like that? Well, part of them protected from other in the north, but some of them is protected from the south. One of the reasons that Columbus sailed the ocean blue was that in 1492. And this comes from a great essay from Conrad Bastable. Anyone can get it. And one of the reasons why Columbus sailed the ocean blue was because Spain just got out underneath the Iberian Peninsula. Just got Catholic monarch Isabella and Ferdinand finally won a 10-year war against the Nasrid dynasty of North Africa, Islamic Caliphate. Most of modern day Spain has been under Muslim rule for 700 straight years, the Umayyad Caliphate. So for 700 years, that's a long time. That's longer than Spain has been, so to speak, free. And that goes back to sort of what did Spain do once it got underneath it? It needed trade routes, and needed spices, it needed gold to maintain its position. So that goes right back into the, it's not entirely one-sided there. But I'll pass this back to Swithin. I thought that'd be an interesting comment to add.
I would agree with both of you. It's obvious that the crusade is not just Christians taking it to the Muslims. It's completely ahistorical. It does relate, though, interestingly, pretty much, well, at least since the 1990s, which I can talk about more clearly. We had an interesting thing in the West is, we have Muslim terrorists. Muslim terrorists are bad. But then, especially the media goes out of its way to find oppressed Muslim groups around the world, because that was something kind of like the justification for. Partially, it was the Kosovan intervention because Milosevic was being nasty to his Muslim population. At least that's how it was sold in the West. And then the Chinese seem to be deeply unpleasant when it comes to the Uyghurs or the Uyghurs. My question is, well, would anybody care if they weren't Muslims, at least in the Western media? Because that seems to be a common theme, which I do think is just part of the general, well, we'll just support anybody who is against what we could consider waspish sort of heritage. And I think that's part of it. And also with the Islamic expansions, I may have mentioned this before, but there were even slaves taken by the Barbary pirates in the county I currently live in England. They went so far north and took slaves, which of course is never spoken about at all. So yeah, TP, any other final comments on the Crusades or the issues surrounding that in general?
Right. Well, I think all three of us have done a pretty good job at sort of addressing the Crusades as a taboo. One interesting thing that I would bring up, just in addition to this, is there was a Christian traveler in the 9th century, a guy known as Bernard the Monk or Bernard the Pilgrim, and he traveled all throughout the Mediterranean world, France, Italy, much of the Levant, Egypt, Tunisia, and so on and so forth. And of course, this is bias coming from a Christian from the Middle Ages, but he described sort of the just in a sort of quasi proto sociological sort of way. He was observing just sort of the atmospheres of different societies, and that he just noticed the different warring and sort of the violent conflicts going on in the Middle East and in places like modern day Syria and Damascus and Tyre and Gaza, that those areas were still under a lot of cities were trading hands between warring Islamic groups there was a lot of infighting. A lot of people don't discuss this, but after Muhammad died, there was a lot of infighting, and that sort of manifested into various conquering campaigns that led north and west from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, where there were many massacres in Jerusalem, in Damascus, and a lot of these historically cities that were built by the Phoenicians centuries earlier, and whereas at least Christian societies, while they were, at that time quite clearly very strictly Catholic, at least there was a higher degree of peace within those territories. Now, that's not, again, I'm not trying to sneak in that, Christianity is more peaceful than Islam, especially during that time, but there was, this was just this was a difficult time because, Islam was splitting between Shiite and Sunni, and you have just a lot of infighting. And so, even there are, Muslim populations in the Balkans, for example, that fled the Middle East because of this, and there was many Muslim settlers in the Balkans and like in northern Greece sometime around in the 11th century. So that's just kind of interesting to observe that. But yeah, it's not just the Christians, taking it to the Muslims, as you said, Swithin. It takes two to play ball. And when you look at just the early history of the Umayyad Caliphate, I mean, it's just an unfortunate chapter of bloodshed in human history. And again, one of the main motivations, again, for the Crusades was that, many Christian pilgrims were being slaughtered, and just outright massacred. And so, well, of course, the medieval Catholic Church is going to do something about that. And this was just simply an age of warfare. So people, when you have the complete historical contextual package together, it shouldn't be surprising that something like the Crusades had manifested.
Zizek, interestingly, it once said that he's a Christian atheist, and it's entirely true. And Marx himself is quite interesting. If you look at the way the Marxists treat rebelling, if you look at the way the Marxists treat indigenous groups, it's not particularly well. And this goes back to Swithin's point about the Muslims in China currently. So as far as groups going out and attacking or ruling Muslims, in some ways the non-taboo group currently, in some ways it's a taboo because they don't want you to talk. Well, maybe it is a taboo, but that goes back to Swithin's point. Why doesn't anyone care about the why doesn't Disney care about the Uyghurs? No one. I think it's their name. Peter Hitchens has a great 5,000 word essay on his travels through there in the old city out there. So yeah, it is quite interesting that the in some ways that tension has continued. But this, I think, goes back to the sort of it is kind of a universalist thing. Christianity is more universalist, but Islam is also universalist too. So it is the intersection of the two great universalist religions in the region. And that boundary is basically the boundary between them, the boundary between Europe and Asia, boundary between Europe and North Africa. And actually, in a place like Egypt, you have these sort of leftover groups, and sort of the Syrian Christians, another group that was recently, had a heck of a lot of problems in recent years too. So that is the intersection. So I think this would flow right into our next question, Swithin. So if you want to take it, that'd be great.
So TP, to possibly one of the most juicy ones that you can go for, is the US-Israel relationship. What is in particular taboo about it? And again, what does it say about the current US media or the US cathedral in Mulbergian terms?
Right. Well, yeah, this is certainly a juicy one. Right. Well, I think, anyone who casually studies U.S. politics or even the history of the 20th century in the West, again, from a U.S. perspective, especially from the 1960s up until the present day, one thing that is quite present within U.S. politics is either the broad majority support or just the basically ubiquitous support for Israeli foreign policy Israeli domestic policy, so on and so forth. I mean, it's self-evident to simply point out that the United States and Israel are bound very tightly at different political, social, and institutional levels. And one thing that is interesting about this is just the nearly mythical amounts of money and technology that has been poured into Israel from the United States since the 1960s. And again, this is one of the great taboos where, I mean, when you look across sort of the interesting histories of the Democratic and Republican parties, they might put on this show for the media and for the public how they viscerally disagree on this issue or that issue. One thing that almost seems, that's not up for discussion is just 110% support for Israel, whatever that means. That it's almost like it's one of the great American political tropes of the 20th and 21st century. Israel is our greatest ally, diversity is our greatest strength, XYZ, fill in the blank. But that is one of the most popular political slogans in the United States, and it's interesting because there is a very interesting 3-part documentary from Al Jazeera called The Lobby. And one of the interesting things about this documentary is it basically details just how deeply that Israeli, how would you say, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and interest groups influence U.S. policy, specifically U.S. foreign policy. Now, a great example of this that not many people know about is that, and there's a guy named Ryan Dawson who's done a lot of good research on this. That has documentaries on these details, but there is something in the Pentagon in the early 2000s and the late 1990s known as the Office of Special Operations, I believe, or the Office of Special Projects. It's one of those two, where a former U.S. Army general, I think it was Wesley Clark, basically kind of rang the alarm bell somewhat, and he said, well, why are we going into all these countries? And basically, this is something that places like Iraq, Iran, Libya, Syria, and Jordan, and a few other places, even like secondary or tertiary locations like Somalia, the Somalian coast. And this was more or less, this U.S. sort of either invading these places outright and replacing them with U.S. and Israeli-friendly governments came from neocon think tanks and Israeli interest groups and lobbying groups, especially AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee. Now, I happen to agree with Ryan Dawson that, if you think the Bilderberg Group wields a great deal of influence, well, take a moment to just reflect on the power that AIPAC has on American politics. I mean, when you look at AIPAC's annual meeting, I mean, it's basically this almost this mega church atmosphere of both Democrats and Republicans getting up and just basically bearing their testimony how, apparently the United States couldn't breathe oxygen without our relationship with Israel, and to kind of wrap a bow around this point, if anyone, anywhere within U.S. society, especially American politics or on the institutional level, dares to question or criticize the relationship between the United States and Israel as something that could potentially be parasitic or disadvantageous, well, then you're not only wrong. I mean, you're potentially an anti-Semite. You are. You have this sort of ethnic hatred of Jews as people, and all they have to do is invoke the events of World War II and sort of the centuries-long sort of anti-Semitic beliefs that have been pressed against Jewish people for centuries. And that's just a quick way of ending the conversation. And just as a last point, with this U.S. and Israeli political relationship, you had something called the BDS, or the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement against Israel, where it was an attempt by different university groups and a few institutions to suggest or to push for the idea that we should sanction or boycott Israeli products coming into the United States as a way of deterring the harsh Israeli treatment of Palestine and the Palestinian occupation. And what happened from there is that there were even several laws passed in a few U.S. states where if your business ended up supporting BDS, well, you could potentially be fined, or you may not be the beneficiary of certain insurances like home insurance. So this is really encroaching on the legal territory now. So, the First Amendment exists, apparently just as long as you don't support divestment or boycotting or sanctioning certain Israeli companies or Israel as a political entity. So yeah, quite a juicy one.
I'm going to just follow up on this and see if you have any further comments, TP. I'm somewhat agnostic on Israel in the sense that I've been to Israel. Israel is probably one of those wealthiest countries per capita. Its GDP, I don't think, fully tells the picture of how wealthy. I mean, I'm saying this in a positive way. I mean, Ben Gurion and his band I mean, it has a lot of similarities to sort of the American Revolution. The sort of 6-day war in 1948. It's really, it is quite an interesting. I mean, they used, they sort of rounded up old Luftwaffe planes and sort of, took a sort of very, in the same way with that's the 48 war and the 67 war, and the 73 war. I mean, they did really pull off a quite amazing series of military and political victories. And they had sort of communist type elements in there. They had sort of communist utopian type elements in there too. So Israel itself is kind of a very interesting society. In some way, it is the 52nd or 51st state of the United States in a certain sense. But as far as the military relationship is concerned, one of the things the defenders will point out is the United States sends a lot of money to everyone. Like, it sends money to Egypt, it sends money to Turkey, it sends this is I'd say the criticism. Now I'm all for talking about it. I'm personally agnostic about it. But what's further interesting is like you have the sort of Palestine type thing where this is where it gets really interesting. You have people like Garen Brooks. It gets sort of it really is a third rail in the sense that there's no clear group to get behind, because if you get behind, if you start defending the Palestinians, then the mainstream might attack you for being an anti-Semite. If you get behind Israel too much, then they'll attack you for being like a messianic or whatever. So there is no way. There's no easy way out. So I think this relates to the first point I made, that sometimes taboos exist because they have to exist. And I would say Israel, to a certain extent, pawns out our the far east border of the U.S. empire. If you think about NATO, NATO technically, does it end in Turkey or not? No, I mean Turkey's not in NATO, but does it end in Ukraine or does it end in Poland? Of course, Ukraine isn't. Poland is, but Israel, in certain ways, is the far east border possibly of the United States. And if Japan and South Korea are the western borders of the U.S. empire. So Israel, in certain ways, is a sort of, an American air base in a very terrible neighborhood, so to speak. So I'm personally agnostic about it. I don't care. What do you have any comments on that, TP?
Right. No, that's fine. And I have a few friends from Israel, and I did some study abroad in Germany in the summer of 2013, and I met people from, everywhere, Southeast Asia, all over Europe, Central and South America, and Israel, and even just I completely agree with you that just societally and even ethnically speaking, I mean, Israel is a really fascinating place, just given how much history has occurred there over the last, I mean, oh heck, like 3,000 years. And if like when Israelis take like a 23andMe or My Ancestry sort of genetic test, well, they're just all over the place. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever taken a genetic test, but I mean, I'm mostly Northern European and from the British Isles and some Southern European. But I mean, it's very typical for modern day Israelis to have genetic roots from all over North Africa, all over Europe, Central Asia, the Arabian Peninsula. So, and you can kind of I mean, I imagine that when you went to Israel, that's almost just something that's observable, just this like really fascinating admixture of Mediterranean peoples. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have this. I mean, I'm not someone who just thinks like, we must destroy Israel and sort of this like finger pointing sort of what would you say, some type of like paramilitary sort of way. Of course, I'm fine with Israel existing. It's just that. And again, it's fine to maintain an agnostic position on that. It's just that when you kind of take a survey of the various ways in which Israel has influenced U.S. foreign policy, well, as you mentioned earlier, Tim, I think we pay Egypt we pay them quite a steep amount of money per year just to prevent them from attacking Israel. And then both public and private money that is poured into Israel yearly is something in the tens of billions. And that's been happening for decades now at varying amounts. But yeah, of course, it's just more the elite institutional upper political relationship that I and many other people have a problem with. It's very I mean, even like Israel at one point, I think in the early sometime around 2010, through a long series of it was almost like a quasi Nuremberg sort of way. They basically pressured Germany into paying for a nuclear powered submarine for Israel on the German people's tab. So, that's an interesting thing. But I mean, that's just one anecdotal example to basically display the power that Israeli political influences can have on any country. And this is also something that's certainly true for Great Britain, probably not to quite the extent of the United States, but certainly in the City of England, there is this concentration of Israeli political influence within the UK. But yeah, sorry, Swithin, I don't want to keep you out of the conversation. I'll hand it over to you, sir.
No, you're right in respect to England. There's a lot of Jews around Manchester and certain parts of London. They pitched over in the late 19th century, if I remember correctly. But to get close to the end, what I think is interesting about Israel is Israel is basically an ethno-state. Yet cannot be criticized very heavily at all without invoking anti-Semitism, which is somewhat ironic as well, considering a lot of the most Orthodox Jews actually think the nation-state of Israel is actually illegitimate. The Maharadi, I can't remember the exact name, believe the nation-state of Israel should only be brought by the Messiah, and since he clearly isn't here yet, it shouldn't exist. So it's a very contradictory taboo to hold. I think it is with Israel. It is a strange position for them. So TP, I think we're getting to the end now. Have you got any final comments on any of the issues we've touched so far, or any concluding comments on taboos in general?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think what you just barely said, Swithin, is a good point. I think for all intents and purposes, even working with the definition loosely, Israel is certainly an ethno-state, but it gets to sort of have, because of earlier events in the 20th century, they sort of get to argue on behalf of Israel as if it were not an ethno-state. And that's one of the things that's frustrating. regardless of what one would think of the far right, typically the nation of Japan is invoked in arguments in preference for a homogeneous society, and Israel and Japan have a lot in common in that regard, in sort of this ethnic homogeneity, and so that's just something that's very frustrating. So it should, we should be able to criticize and to examine certain parasitic aspects of the relationship between the United States and Israel. Of course, it's fine to be Jewish or to be Israeli. It's even okay to be a Jewish elite. But what is not okay is sort of this continued, uninterrupted relationship between the United States and Israel, where basically we have been getting rid of a lot of different Middle Eastern regimes like Gaddafi and Hussein, and we have been diminishing the influence of Syria, largely at the behest of Israeli foreign policy. Now, I'll just say real quickly that I think it was in 2004 or 5 or 6. I apologize if I get the year wrong, but there was a conflict in southern Lebanon between the Israeli Defense Forces and Hezbollah. And one thing that was interesting there, this is just sort of a fascinating piece of military history, is that while Israel has its own very robust tech sector and a very robust military, they don't have the numbers. In a sort of a interestingly ironic way, Todd Lewis, who goes by Praise of Folly on YouTube, he and I have discussed this in private a lot, where Israel is not like the Soviet Union in that they can trade land for time. They have to be very much like Germany in the sense that there is no time to waste and there's no buffer zones anywhere. They have to strike at the most critical targets, and it all has to happen within several hours. The Air Force has to strike ammo and fuel depots just at the right time, and artillery has to be hitting just the right columns and convoys at just the right amount of time. And if not, a lot of casualties are suffered. And what happened is that there was basically a very costly stalemate for the Israeli forces. Now, and that was with sort of like a minimal level of U.S. intelligence support. So, again, it's fine to be, and it's even fine if your preference is pro-Israeli. But one thing that needs to be, declared safely, again, without losing your job, without losing your reputation, is that it's okay to criticize Israeli influence on American institutions and government. And, it doesn't mean that you're an anti-Semitic person. It's not, rarely things are that black and white, and that certainly applies to this subject as well. But without carrying on too much longer, thanks, Tim and Swithin, for having me. I really like your guys' show. I'm a lifelong fan, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks for joining us, TP. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah,
I'd now just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've liked this show, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on YouTube and Podbean. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the rankings, and the more people can enjoy the show. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.